Thank you for joining us for another Maximum Code tutorial using C# to access SQL Server. In this session, we'll go over datasets and data adapters. We'll also finish up a few things that we left off for SQL Data Reader. So let's take a look at datasets and what are they. They're really like a in-memory database. It's not a full-fledged database, but it does have a lot of its features. For example, a dataset can have multiple data tables. These tables can have one or more columns and rows, and you can put an index on the column. You can have views to join one or more tables. We also said datasets are like an in-memory database, but you can also persist it to an XML file and then deserialize it later and have it in memory again. So datasets and all of its objects are considered disconnected from the SQL Server. You don't have to have a SQL Server connection. You can also add SQL data into datasets using a data adapter or a data reader to a data table, and we'll see examples of those in the upcoming tutorial. So the connected object you see on the right are SQL Server connections. They require SQL connection, and once opened, you can then execute a command to get the data reader. As you read the reader, you must still have a connection open to SQL Server, therefore it's connected. You can pass the data reader to a data adapter, which in turn returns a data set. We also have to point out that the connected objects reside in the Microsoft.data.sql client assembly, but the disconnected objects are in system.data.common assembly. Why have connected and disconnected objects? It really comes down to one thing: the time it takes to perform the work required. Do your intensive work that takes a long period of time using datasets. For best practices, you should really connect to SQL Server for a very short period of time, get the data, close the connection. You do this for performance reasons. Every connection opens and adds resources on the server. Imagine on a commerce site having hundreds of thousands of requests per second. Those requests will add pressure to the server. Sure, you can cache the data to alleviate the pressure, but some commerce sites would use live data like inventory. As people check out, you need to keep a product on a site versus remove it as it shows it out of stock. Also know that in most cases you don't need a data set. You can have your own object that you can use to map the data reader. As a matter of fact, we suggest that you should do instead of using data sets. Most sites use data sets because they cache the data, or seen examples on Microsoft's website that do this. Datasets are big and bulky and they take a lot of memory. You should use datasets if you're performing data-like functions but not being connected to a SQL Server. So as we suggested earlier, there are areas of data reader we didn't really get into last time. Before we go into the data sets and data adapters, let's just dive in and kind of catch up on these scenarios. So we have our example here where we have our connection string, and we're gonna then use our connection objects and then call a SQL statement and add our parameters and then call the data reader. So this example will work just fine. You've seen this actually functioning, but what happens when you have more than one select statement coming back? So let's just go over this so we can see how we can do this. In this example, we'll just go ahead and create a loop to output all of the Raiders data. And what we're going to do is actually use the method hasRows. If the data reader has rows, then we want to start looping and reading the data as we loop through. And we'll go ahead and also output the first column of the reader just for an example to see the data on the console. And let's go ahead and execute this program to make sure that the results are coming back. Now this is just one select statement. We should have our 3 rows that we had before. So now what if we added a second statement to this, and how we would handle that? So let's just go ahead and just do select star this time instead of doing a where clause with a parameter. So now we have 2 statements. And how would this work, and how would you read it? Well, after you read the first the statement, then you can actually say move the cursor to the next reader. So we'll call the next results method, and now our cursor has moved over to the next results. And then our loop will continue again. We have rows, yes, and then we will output the results. So let's go ahead and put some empty lines so we can see the spacing between the two. And let's execute our program again. So now we should see the 3 rows plus a few more afterwards. Yep, and we do see, so everything is working and functioning just fine. So then this was just using T-SQL. What if we had our store procedure, and then in our store procedure we had the same thing, we had 1 or more select statements coming back. So let's go ahead to our example database, and we'll look at the store procedure that we had, and let's modify it to have more than 1 statement coming back. Let's clean it up a little bit to where we have just a 1 ID parameter, and also take out the print statement and the count. And let's just go ahead and do the same thing as we did previously. Let's go ahead and execute that. So the changes were applied, no errors. And let's go ahead and modify our code to call the store procedure instead. Same as before, we go ahead and change the T-SQL and also the command type to store procedure. And now if we execute the code, we should have exactly the same results. And everything is looking just like it did before. So next we'll look at 2 other functions where SQL command can work. And there are scenarios you want to do this. So let's go ahead and comment this out. And let's take our reader, but instead of executing the reader, we'll execute a non-query. So if you look at the results of this, it's returning an int, and it states that it's usually you want to execute this against connections that return a number of rows affected. So for example, doing updates, deletes, and inserts. So that's what really this is for, because you want to know how many rows got affected. So let's take a look at how this works. Okay, and then what we have to do is also change the store procedure to text for now. And let's go figure out what the insert is going to look like. So we'll come in here really quickly and go to our table. We can script this as an insert if you don't know your SQL query. So let's take a look at how we can do this. As you notice, we do have this little parameter that we can go and update. This being an int, let's use a 10, and this being an integer, let's make sure we comment that out, and we'll just use something and click OK. So now we have a SQL statement that we can use to insert values into our database. If we insert this record and take a look at our table, we should have a value for blah, and we do. Let's go back and change this to 11 and just put something on there. Let's copy this and go to our SQL statement. And let's go ahead and put a breakpoint so we can see what the end value should be. It should be 1 because there's only one record being affected. So if we go back, you can see that it's one record being affected. Well, what if this was the store procedure being executed and you execute it as non-query? What would happen at that point? Well, so if we go back to our table and execute this, let's see what would happen for this. It should not return any values. Actually, by default, it returns a -1. And if we look, it is -1 because this is a store procedure and it's not really an update statement or an insert, and therefore it's not returning anything. So we do have a set no count on. Let's actually turn this off. Maybe this is interfering to return to see if there's a record being updated or not, or selected, and see what the results will be. It should still be negative. So let's take a look and see how that's going to work. And it's still -1, and that's because this really is for insert, updates, and delete statements. And there's also one other example. So let's go ahead and comment that guy out. And this one is, there are times where you need the first row and the first column of the queries that is coming back. And that's all the data you need. You're going to ignore everything else. This is returning an object. So let's go ahead and put this in a job object, because remember that this could be a string, it could be a different date time, it could be another data type. So first row, and we'll keep this as a store procedure. So if we execute the store procedure and we put a value of 1, now of course we're getting two record sets, but we're asking for the first row, so it should be 1. Actually, let's go and make this a little bit simpler. So let's make this, let's comment this out. So this way we are, and then let's actually do an order by descending. Let's order by the first column, so ID descending. So that executed. Let's actually execute our store procedure again. Now we did this because we want to make sure that this would be 11 and not 1. So that's what the value we should see back by executing the store procedure. And let's go ahead and execute the store procedure. And we do have 11 coming back. What's interesting to note here is that when you're calling the execute non-query and execute scalar, you do not have the reader open, and there is actually no reader. So if you wanted to get a return value from the store procedure, you could do that without having to wait for anything to close, because this is not a reader. It's actually making a connection, gets data really quick from SQL Server, and it comes back, and there's no stream, so therefore you don't have to wait for it to close. So now we're going to take a look at the other aspects of the SQL command, returning actually XML. So we have this XML execute XML reader, and if we look, it's returning an XML reader. So let's just go ahead and change this to an XML reader. It should be, and change this to, and so what we need to do now is reference the system.xml, and so that satisfies that. Next thing we want to do is let's go ahead and comment these guys out and change this to text for now. And what we want to do is pass it a query that's returning us an XML. So we've generated one already, and if we execute this, you'll see that we have the data before tabular. So now if we tell it that it's for XML, return as an XML data, it's actually returning us an XML data. And if we select this, you can see that we are getting the schema first, and then we get every row for the records coming back. So if we execute this and we put a breakpoint here, let's take a look and see how that's going to look like. So now the XML reader okay, so we actually didn't update our query, so let's actually do that now. Okay, let's try this again. So now the reader, well, the XML reader is very similar to the data reader, so we'll have to actually read this XML first, just like a stream that we did before, so that we can go and see what the so the reader is true, meaning that we have data in there. Now if we try to take a look at this, we have node type to see what kind of node type that we are working with. It's an element, and then now if we say the name is schema, so now we are getting the schema, so most likely this data is this schema information here. So let's go ahead and try to get the outer XML, and we have a string coming back as an XML. So if we paste this here, and let's actually remove these because these are not valid. These are escape characters, and change those. So as you can see, this is very similar to what we saw in SQL. And then now if we read this again, it is true, and then look at node type, it's still an element. But if we look at the name, it is now the table 1, which means that this is now we're working with the records. So if we were to now look at the outer XML, this is now returning as the ID, and this is the column ID with 2 test data, and we have some values coming back from the from our database. So in this exercise, we have reset our environment. We have our store procedure, do and execute reader. We have rows we loop through, and we get the data. Here we have our store procedure, same as before. So if we execute it, we should get 2 record sets being displayed. The first one is the where clause, which has the 1, and then the second result set has all the data coming back. So this looks good. Let's go ahead and actually change this so that we can use a dataset and a SQL Data Adapter basically. So we'll go ahead and comment the code out here. And let's go ahead and start with our SQL adapter. And then let's go ahead and create a data set. And then now use our SQL Data Adapter to fill our data set. But you notice that the SQL Data Adapter is actually not associated with anything. So the first thing we can do is pass it the SQL command. The SQL command has our connection, so it already has the information it needs to fill the data set. And let's go ahead and delete these lines of code so we can get a clean screen. And let's execute our code. And we should see both the record sets coming back. So here's in table 1 our first record set, and then in table 2 our table 1 should be our second data. So now we're going to show you that you don't have to have your connection open because the data adapter will do that for you. So as you notice now that the connection was not opened by us, it was internally opened by the adapter, and the same information is being returned back. So the next thing we want to do is actually do some table mappings. So this way, instead of having table 1, we can actually make it more friendly. So we'll just call this customer, or employees would be better. And then maybe create another one with like departments. Now in the table, if you have more than one table, this will be n, representing the numerical value of the table. So let's change it to table 1 because that's what it will be, and then call this department. And if we execute this, our table names will change from table to table 1 to the employee and department. So now you've seen how we can pass a command to the data adapter. Let's go ahead and show you that you don't need a SQL command. So if you just had a T-SQL and you want to pass that, we can do that using also one of the overloads. So we can pass a SQL command and then the connection object. So let's just pick one of these queries. Let's pick the one without the parameter. Comment out our mappings and execute our code, and we should have one table in there. So as you can see, we have a bunch of overloads, and one of them is that instead of doing the mapping with adapter, we can just pass it with a fill, and it should name our table _1, and it did. So now let's take a look at the dataset structure. So the data set has many objects, and as you've already seen the data table, but we all have data view, And then we have relationships that can go together, putting two tables, kind of like if you're interested in SQL and you've done inner joins, that would be something similar. You can put constraints. You can have a primary key for the table. The table has rows and columns, of course. And then the data set, data table, and the data column all have extended properties. So now that we have a quick overview of all the objects that are in here, let's take a look at see how we can actually iterate through these data tables, and then how to use a data view and how to add the relationships between the two tables. So we're back in the code that we were working with. So let's go ahead and clean some stuff up. So let's go ahead and create two SQL adapters, one being a customer adapter. So we're actually going to go ahead and probably use our Northwind database. And let's pass our connection and just keep the T-SQL empty. So let's go to our Northwind database. So we'll just use customers and orders. And change our initial catalog to Northwind so that we're in the right database. So we just do a quick select from the table that we're looking for, and then we'll go ahead and create the second adapter. Please be mindful that we are using the same connection, but you could have different connections from different databases. So you could pull data from multiple databases and then add them to the same data set. So now that we have customers and orders, let's go ahead and create a data set. And we can also name our data set. Data set is, we said that it's going to be almost like an in-memory database. So this would probably represent a Northwind database because it has two of the tables. And then let's go ahead and use the customer adapter to fill the data set using our query for customers. Actually, this should be a data set and not the adapter because we have already used the adapter for fill. And then we can also name the table to customers. And let's go ahead and copy and paste this and then use the order adapter and then name the table orders. Okay, so now we're going to have a data set that has two tables, customers and orders. And let's go ahead and try to create a relationship between customers and orders. So to do that, we'll use a new object, data relation. So here we'll go ahead and actually use the DataSet table relations and then add, because it's going to return back so it's going to return back a relation, a data relation object. So when we are adding this relationship, we need to tell it that we are we're going to name our relation. So we're going to call this cust orders. And it's going to require two columns because we need to tell it that we're going to use the column from the customers. And we'll use maybe the customer ID. So this will be the data table customers, and use the columns. And in the customer object, there is a column for customer order. And then the second column, it needs to reflect the orders, also has a customer ID. So we'll just pretty much do the same thing, except change the table to now point to orders. So now we set up a relation, and so the next thing we need to do, so that was for the customer order ID from customers and customer ID from orders. So now that we have a relation, let's go ahead and pull data based on this relationship. So we'll use the data set. We're going to use the tables, and now we're going to use so we're going to iterate through the customer tables, and this should be data rows, or data row, one singular. So let's name this primary row. So we're going to choose a customer and then get the relationship of orders associated to this customer. So let's just print out the column, the very first one for customer ID. And then now we're gonna loop through and get all of the children associated to this customer, which will be the orders. So it'll be a data row again, but this will be the secondary row. So we're gonna get the primary row, and then we're gonna say get the child rows, passing the relationship that we created earlier. And now we're just gonna go ahead and do console.writeLine of the secondary row. We're gonna go ahead for visual effect. We're gonna tab it so that it'll be a little bit over, so it'll be easier to see. And use the order ID. So if we did everything correctly, oh yeah, so we need to change this to make sure that this is rows. So if we did everything correctly, we should see, for each customer, we should see their orders. So if we look at the data set, we should have two tables. So we have customers, and we have orders. There's quite a bit of orders, so that's probably going to be doing a lot of output, which is not a problem. We just need to see the some rows. So as you can see, we're getting the customer ID. For each customer, we're getting all of their orders. So in this session, we're gonna go ahead and use the SQL DataAdapter and figure out how to use the data view. And that's basically, data view is allowing you to set filtering and sorting on a table within the data set. So let's go ahead and start with our SQL Data Adapter, and let's just keep this as customer adapter. And let's put our query here, and we're going to use the same query as before. Select from customers, and we will pass our connection object and make sure that we are connected to our Northwind database, and we are. And next we're going to go ahead and create our data set. Let's call this cust data set. So the next thing we want to do is now fill our customer adapter using the cust data set, and let's name our table same as before, customers. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create some variables that we can use for our data view. So the first thing is that we have to act on a table so that we can set filtering and sorting on it. So let's go ahead and create a data view and create this cust data view. So if we take a look at this, it takes a couple of values. So it takes a data table, a row filter, a sort, and a row state. So let's actually create those variables. So the first one is going to be a data table, and this is going to be our cust table. And basically we're going to go to our cust data set under tables, and in the tables you can actually ask the get the table through the indexer or through the name. So since we already have our name, let's use customers. So now we have our data table, and the next thing we need to do is create a filter, and our filter is going to look something like this. We want to get all of the data that's country equals USA. So like a where clause within T-SQL, we need to put the single quotes on it. And then the next thing we need to do is create a string for sort. And which column we want to sort on? Let's do it by contact name. And then in our data view, we'll go ahead and pass our customer table. So we have our filter, and then we have our sort. And for the row state, we will use the enum for current rows, and that means that this is the current rows including unchanged, new, and modified rows. So we'll go ahead and use that. And let's go ahead and put a breakpoint and take a look at this before going through and see how we can extract data from the or iterate through the customer data view. So if we execute this, so here's our data set, and if we open it, we have quite a bit of piece of data here. And if you look at our country, we do have Germany, Mexico, from pretty much every country that there is, and there's some for US as well. So basically what we're doing is just extracting only for the US. And also we are sorting by customer or the contact name. Yep. So now this is our view. So let's take out our view. And if you can see, it's much less data. And if we go, we can see that it's only the US countries. And if we look at the contact names, it's being sorted alphabetically from A to Y. So now we know we have our view working correctly. Now let's go ahead and figure out how to get data or iterate through this. So it's not going to be a data row. It's actually going to be a data row view. So our data row view. And for the collection, we will use the customer data view. And let's go ahead. There's a couple of ways to get this. Let's just do it through getting the column counts. But you can also get the, you've seen the row in the reader to get a array. So there is a way to get that value through that. So if we go to the row view row item array, you can get all of the data. But for this one, we're just going to go through the columns. So we're just going to go a for loop, and we want this to be the cust data view dot table dot columns dot count. So now that we have that, we can just do console.write. So this time we're going to say write because we're looping through the columns and not the actual row. So this one is looping through rows, and this is doing through columns. So we just want to just write it without having a new line. So let's go ahead and do that now. And so let's just do row view and the index value of I. So that gives us every column. And what we're also going to do is we're going to tab it so that each column is tabbed once. And then once the columns are written, now we can do a console.write line so that we can open a new line for the next row that comes in. So let's just go ahead and execute this. And if we expand this, as you can see, now we have all our columns, and some of the data is pushed because of the spacing, but you can see that the data is being outputted. So there's something else you could do as well. As you notice that we actually have a table to the customer data view, and if you didn't feel like going through these row view and that might be too much for you, then what you can do is actually towards the end, let's just put this, we can actually, let's go to create a variable of a data table. So we just call this data table for now. And what we're going to do is going to say to table. And this will return a, instead of a data view, it will return a data table. So as you can see, it's the same exact data as the view, and the sorting is still preserved. So now let's go back to how we created a SQL command. This time we're going to create it a little bit differently. So let's actually create the variable. And this time we're going to use the connection. We had showed this before. Create a command, and all it does is returns back a SQL command for us to use. So we'll go ahead and use the SQL command. This is a quicker way, so you don't have to fill the property of the connection from the command. So you have this connection object here that you could pass in. We don't have to do that now. So we're just going to do the command type, and this is going to be text. So, and then for the SQL command text, and let's go ahead and just do select star from customers, and then open our connection. And then let's go ahead and create our SQL Data Adapter, or excuse me, SQL Reader, not Data Adapter. So now we're going to execute our command. And get a reader. So the next thing we want to do is create our data table. So what we want to do is take this reader and transform it into a table. So data table, there's a command or a method called load. And we can pass it the SQL Data Reader, and that should fill the data table. So let's execute our program. And if we look at our data table, as you can see now, we have all of our data coming back from the reader. So far, we've worked with the SQL objects when they were connected to SQL Server. Using a SQL connection, we got a data reader. We can take a data reader and add it to a data table, and then take the SQL adapter and add the data to the data set. So pretty much data was coming in from SQL Server. So how do we work really truly disconnected? So let's go ahead and just actually create a data table and create some columns and then add some data to it. So we'll create our new data table, and let's actually name this table 1, similar to our database here, table 1. And what we're going to do is exactly create the same columns. So let's go back here. So we have our data table. If we run this, it'll just be an empty data table, nothing else in there. To create columns, we have to use the data column object. So we'll just create now a column. We'll call this column ID, and then new data column. And then we'll take this column ID and set as data type. And we will set the data type to be get type. And this is we're going to pass it a string, and this is going to be the name of the type we were working with in C#. So this will be system.int32. So this is actually an int, and it will get converted to a SQL integer type. And then for the column ID to allow DB nulls, it's going to be true. And the reason is that if we go back to our database, we do have our ID as null. So it's an int and it's a null. We do allow nulls in there. And then the next thing is to name our column. So we can say column name equals to an ID. So this actually creates a column, and the first one. So let's just go ahead and copy all this, because we're going to now create the second column. So this one is going to be for the, I believe we called it test data. So let's go back here and see if that's what we called it. Yep, test data, and it's nchar. So now this is going to be system.string because it's being nchar. Allowed nulls. I do believe we said we allowed nulls. Yep. So we'll keep that as true, but then for the name, we will change this to be test data. So now let's go ahead and change all of these columns. So there we go. So now we've created two columns, and now we need to add this to our data table. So we go to the columns in our data table and we'll say add. And so the first one is going to be our column ID. The second is going to be our test data. So now we have associated to our table two columns. The next thing we need to do is figure out how to add rows into this. So let's just do a quick for loop. We'll loop through, let's say, 30, and let's actually start our counter from 20. So we're going to loop 10 times starting from 20, and now we're going to create our data row. So we can create a data row object, and we'll just call this row. We'll keep it as null for now, and because what we're going to do is assign, as we loop through, we're going to reuse the same variable, and then we'll go to our data table, and then we'll say new row. So this will return as a data row object, and we're going to take this row and say that the column is going to be ID, and let's just do I plus 1, and then do the same thing for test data, except for the test data, let's actually do something else, and we'll call this blah underscore, and then the increment this once. So now that we have this row, we need to add the row to the data table. So we'll go to the data table .rows.add, and we'll add our row into this. So at this point, let's go ahead and actually put a breakpoint and run this. So at this point, we should have an empty table, and we're about to add a row into our table. So we have our data table, and if we open it, it should be totally empty. There's no rows associated. And if we look at this row object, so it's the row is, the parent table is table 1. If we look at the data into it, it's starting from 21, and it's blah 21. That's all good. And if you notice, the row state says it's detached. The reason it says it's detached is because it's not associated to anything. So as soon as we add this row to the table, the row state will change. It says added, which means that this is a row that was added into the table. So if we put another breakpoint to outside of this and we continue, and now we should have a data table with some data inside of it, and we do. So you could do a couple of things. So let's go ahead now. How do you associate the data table to a data set? Well, we'll create a new data set. And we could actually name this to our database. And then take our dataset .tables.add, and then we will add our data table into this. So now we have a data set with a table in it, and if we wanted to add additional tables, we can do that. So there is one thing we can do. We can also say that the rows that we've added into here, we can say accept changes. Changes to data table dot accept changes. So once you said accept changes, the row state will change. So let's take a look and see what that would look like. So now if we go here to the data table and we'll take a look at one of the rows. We'll just take the last one. It says it's unchanged. So if we were to go in there and add a bunch of rows again, you'll have some that says, you'll have all the pre-existing ones will say unchanged and new ones will say added. So you can actually control what type of data that's being, you can go through based on the row state, you can see what was updated and what was inserted into the data table. Now, this is great, but how do you now take this and push this back to SQL Server? So we would need to have our connection object and our connection string. And the next thing we would need is a SQL adapter. So let's go ahead and create SQL Data Adapter. Now, if we just do this, it's not connected to anything. What we need to do is either give it a command or pass it a connection with a T-SQL. So we'll keep the T-SQL blank for right now, and let's choose our connection. Just to satisfy the requirement here, we could just say select star from the table _1 that we were using back here. And so now the data adapter is going to be connected to our SQL, and it'll have information about the table that we are about to put data into. Now, to associate the data table to the adapter, we could do SQL DataAdapter dot update. And if you look, you can pass it either rows, a data set, or a data table. So for this example, let's just do our data table. And if we execute this, it's actually going to generate an error. But let's take a look and see what that error is. So if we look at the error, it says update requires a valid insert command. In order for the adapter to know how to take our data and insert it into the database, it needs to have to know what kind of insert statements this needs to happen. If you notice, we did this before. We were doing an insert. So it creates this insert statement. Let's actually put some values here, like 31, blah 31, click OK. So if we So it would require an insert statement like this, but these values are actually variables like this. So it would have to have a declare and then at 0 and probably this will be an int and another declare at 1 and char, and I believe this was 10. So it would need something like this as part of a command. We could generate this and take exactly what we have here and then insert parameters like we did before and create our command and then pass that to the adapter. But there's a little bit of an easier way, and we can actually use a SQL command builder. So let's go ahead and just create a SQL command builder, and if we look at the parameters for the SQL command, it requires an adapter. So if we pass our SQL adapter, this is pretty much all we should be able to do. And if you wanted to see what the maybe an update or a delete or an insert would look like, you could say give me the command, and we can just say this is going to be SQL command, and this is going to be SQL command insert. So let's go ahead and put a breakpoint here. We're going to see what this looks like. And this insert now should work. So before we also do this, let's go over here, make sure that we don't have any records in our database. We should have our previous records, but we should start seeing records from 20 on to 30 being inserted into the database once we're done. So we have everything here. Let's just go and see what this insert command looks like. So we got an exception, and that's probably because of our not one database. So we're pointing to the wrong database. Let's go ahead, actually also look at the command builder. And if we go to the data adapter, we'll notice that the delete command is empty. The select command has a select. That's because we passed that over. And if you look at insert command also is null. So most likely these will get generated after the update happens. So let's go ahead and move this past the SQL adapter. Let's go ahead and execute our program again. So right before doing the update, if we also take a look again at the SQL command builder, you'll notice that everything is null as far as the deletes, the inserts. So now let's go ahead and execute this. Now we should have inserted all our records into our database. If we go in and re-execute this query, we do see our data populated in the database. And now if we take a look at the insert command, we can see that it is the exact same command that we had talked about in SQL by inserting to the two fields with parameters. Of course, we don't have any of the delete command or any of the update command because we haven't used that. And that usually would have happened based on the row state. So if the row state did not say added, then it would have done either a delete or an update. So previously we showed you how to insert records into our database, and so now we're going to show you how to do the same thing disconnected, and then using the SQL Data Adapter to update and delete. And the reason for this is because update is a little bit tricky. There's some row versioning that happens with concurrency, and if you try to execute it just as we showed you, it'll fail. So let's actually go ahead and grab our SQL connection string and connection. And let's keep this. So what we need to do is create a data table. Now, instead of dynamically creating the columns and setting everything up, we're going to do it from the server. We're going to pull the schema from the server. One of the other things I wanted to point out is that when you are updating records using SQL Adapter and the SQL Command Builder, you're going to have a primary key on your table. Otherwise, it won't work. And the reason is because it needs to use a where clause for a unique key to be able to do the update. So let's go ahead, and now that we've already gone and set up our table with a primary key, so this is all have to be unique. We actually modified all of the values we had here for 1. So now that we have our data table, how we get the schema is we go to our SQL adapter and we say fill, but we're going to do fill schema. So this takes a data table, and then it requires a schema type. We want to pull the schema from the source, so we'll go ahead and accept that. So now that we have our database with the schema, what we can do is go ahead and create some new rows. So let's do that now. So it creates 2 data rows. We're not going to do the insert because we've already shown you how to do that. So we'll just do update, and let's do one more for delete. And now what we need to do is create from the data table rows, or a data table new row. So this gives us 2 new rows to work with. Next, what we need to do is the row that we want to delete, we need the column, which is the ID. And let's set what we're going to delete is the record 21. And for the row that we want to update, let's do 20. Now the row, we're not going to just update, we're going to say test data for the column. And we'll do 20, setting it as an X. Or let's just say update it. Okay, so now we have these 2. Next, what we need to do is use our data table, select rows, add, and then add our new rows into this. So now that we have that going, let's go ahead and use the data table to accept changes. And then what we need to do is delete the record. So now it'll get updated to be ready for deletion. And if we go to for the update, okay, so if we run this, it's gonna fail. Let's take a look at why it's gonna fail. We're gonna use our SQL Server to profile the query that's coming in to see exactly why that's happening. So Query Profiler is a really great tool for debugging SQL events. So like if any connections that are made and it's failing, you can come in here, you can check to see if the username and password, if it's a login issue or something else. So we'll just remove that because we don't need this because it's too much noise, and leave the rest of them as is for now. But you can go back there if you pause this. Actually, let's stop this and then go to properties. You can actually come in here and you can have a lot more columns, more data to see which database ID, database name, or you can choose for a lot more events in here. So we'll just keep this as is for now. And let's go ahead and execute this. We'll keep the profiler stopped for right now until we come into our update. Okay, so let's go ahead and now start tracing. So this is going to fail because of concurrency issues. Let's go to our SQL Server. Let's go and pause this. So this is the query that we're trying to use. So if we grab everything and bring it to SQL Server, so we're doing a delete with a where clause, and we're saying where ID is equal to the parameter, and we're saying if parameter 2 is equal to 1 and test data is null. And so of course this is failing because it's looking for what the test data should be. And the same thing will happen with the update. So what we can do is a couple of things. There is a way to come in here and actually tell this to what the record for test data is. So that would be blah 21. So this will work for the delete, but it will fail for the update. And the reason for this is that it expects the data. It expects to know what the data is in the database, and that's why it's trying to match that, and it's not finding that. Therefore, it can't do the delete. Same thing with the update. So now that we know the issue, let's go ahead and comment out the row delete. We'll just show you how to do the update, and the row delete would be exactly the same thing. So this way we'll give you a chance to go ahead and check that out yourself. Okay, so to fix this, because what happens is the command builder will build a generic T-SQL for you, which is what we see here. And what we want to do is we want to overwrite this so that we can take control over what happens with the delete or an update in our case. So we'll just use our SQL builder, and we need to use our SQL Data Adapter, and we're gonna set the update command. So remember, this is pretty similar to what we've done before in the past. So we'll have our update that needs to happen. So our update should be update table 1, and then we're going to set test data equals to add let's do this for P2, where ID equals to add parameter 1. Okay. So now we need to tell it the parameters that we're passing and how it's supposed to map that for us. So we're gonna go ahead and parameters.add. We're gonna need 2 parameters. So the first one is going to be the name of the parameter. So we said that this is going to be at, it doesn't matter if it's the P1 or P2, we'll just use P1 for now. The second one is going to be the type, it's int, and the third parameter is going to be the size, int is 4, and the last one is going to be the column, so we're going to say ID. And this is so that when we are passing it these the data, we are telling it if it's ID, the column is ID, this is the parameter that should be mapped to it, so that internally it sets the correct data for us. So let's do the same thing for this one. So this will be P2. And the data type will be nchar, oops. And the size is 10. And the column is going to be test data. Okay, so now that we have the parameters set up for us, we should be good for the update. So we have the row update, ID of 20. We're updating the test data. We add it to the table, accept the changes, and then set the row state as modified so that the update can be picked up. So let's go ahead and execute this. And now let's go ahead and run our profiler. So the update went successful, and here's our query that came out. We'll pause this and go to our database, and let's refresh this, and as you can see, it's been updated. So you can go and do the same thing for the delete. You could actually overwrite this for the insert as well. Thank you for staying towards the end. This concludes our tutorial for this one. And in the next version of our tutorial, we'll go over how to create typed data sets, as well as look in and see how we can create database files using C# and do many different things like query the tables, columns, and everything else. So we'll see you next time. Thank you.